The silence in the Windsor High School auditorium was deafening as 18-year-old Grace Johnson faced the assembly of teachers. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the dossier that supposedly contained irrefutable evidence of her academic fraud. The air conditioning blew cold, but it was the chill of fear that made her shiver. "Miss Johnson, the evidence is conclusive," declared Principal Richard Thompson, his deep voice echoing through the empty hall. "Your research papers from the last 3 semesters show clear signs of data manipulation and plagiarism." Grace felt her stomach churn. 3 years of relentless dedication, sleepless nights of studying, and participation in every research project possible, all of it was about to crumble because of one lie. Her mind flashed back to the previous week when she found her locker broken into and her original notes missing. At the time, she had no idea it was only the beginning. "But Principal Thompson, I can explain. I have backups of my original data at home. I can bring them tomorrow." "My lab notebooks," Grace tried to argue, but she was cut off by Professor Diana Wells, the head of the science department. "We've already reviewed all the necessary evidence," Diana interrupted, her cold gaze fixed on Grace. "Including the altered records found on your personal computer in the lab." Grace felt her blood turn to ice. Her computer? She had never allowed anyone else access to that machine. How could altered records have been found there? The answer began forming in her mind like a dark puzzle. Principal Thompson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses in a deliberate motion. "Given the severity of the accusations and the evidence presented, we have no choice but to determine your immediate expulsion from Windsor High. Your scholarship will be revoked, and all partner institutions will be notified of this decision." The words struck Grace like physical blows. Her vision darkened at the edges, and for a moment she feared she might faint. Her dreams of attending medical school, carefully planned since childhood, were being shattered before her eyes. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling with indignation. I could never falsify my work. Something's wrong here. Someone is setting me up." That's when she noticed something odd. In the corner of the auditorium, half hidden in the shadows, stood Amanda Reynolds, her former lab partner. A faint smile played on Amanda's lips, and her eyes gleamed with poorly concealed satisfaction. A shiver ran down Grace's spine as she recalled the silent rivalry that had always simmered between them, especially after Grace had been chosen to lead the biochemistry research project. "The decision is final," Thompson declared, closing the folder in front of him with a definitive snap. "You have until the end of the day to collect your belongings and leave the campus. Your presence will no longer be welcome here." Grace stood mechanically, her legs feeling as heavy as lead. As she walked toward the exit, she passed Amanda, who leaned in and whispered almost inaudibly, "You should have agreed to share the research credit when you had the chance." In that moment, everything became painfully clear. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a brutal clarity. Amanda, with her father on the board of directors and privileged access to the labs, had orchestrated her downfall. But how could she prove it? How could she fight against a system that had already condemned her? In the empty hallway, Grace leaned against the cold wall, letting the tears finally fall. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from her mom, Sandra, asking how the meeting went. How could she explain that her daughter, the family's pride, was being expelled for fraud? How could she tell her mother that all the sacrifices, all the extra hours worked to supplement the scholarship, now seemed to have been for nothing? That afternoon, as she emptied her locker under the curious and judgmental gazes of other students, Grace made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let this injustice define her future. If the system could be corrupted to destroy an innocent student, she had to figure out how to fight it. Not for revenge, but for justice, not just for herself, but to ensure that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. At home, sitting at her small desk, Grace stared at the Supreme Court poster she'd kept on her wall since she was a child. It had once represented only a vague admiration for the judicial system. Now, as she looked at the solemn figures of the justices, a new determination took root in her heart. If she couldn't be a doctor, she would find another way to make a difference. She would become a lawyer and use the very system that had wronged her to protect others from similar fates. Her mother entered the room, her eyes red from crying, but her lips curved into a brave smile. "Grace Johnson, my daughter, no matter what happens, we'll get through this together." Grace embraced her mother, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability before pulling herself together. "Mom, I promise I'll prove my innocence. But more than that, I'll become someone who can fight against this kind of injustice." That night, while the city slept, Grace began researching law programs and admission processes. The path ahead would be long and challenging, but she was resolute. The injustice she had suffered wouldn't mark the end of her story. It was merely the beginning of a journey far greater than she had ever imagined. Windsor College, with its towering spires, was now part of her past. Her future, though uncertain, glimmered with new possibilities. The young woman who had entered that auditorium dreaming of becoming a doctor was gone, but in her place stood a warrior, determined to fight not only for herself but for all those silenced by a corrupt system. The first rays of sunlight found Grace sitting on her unmade bed, her eyes red from a sleepless night. The small apartment she shared with her mother, once a cozy sanctuary after long hours of study, now felt suffocating, its walls lined with reminders of what could have been. Every honor roll certificate, every photo from science competitions, every medal earned, they all seemed to mock her, echoing the life that had been cruelly stolen away. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted into her room, followed by the soft sounds of her mother's footsteps in the kitchen. Sandra was already up, preparing for another grueling double shift. The clinking of dishes carried a different weight now, each sound a stark reminder of the extra burden her mother would have to bear because of the expulsion. "Grace?" Sandra's voice cut through the closed door. "Coffee's ready, honey. You need to eat something." Swallowing the lump in her throat, Grace stood and walked to the kitchen. The sight of her mother, already dressed in her uniform for the first job of the day, dark circles under her eyes but still wearing a brave smile, made her heart ache. "I got a job," Grace announced abruptly, her voice hoarse. "At the legal bookstore downtown. I start today." Sandra stopped stirring her coffee, turning slowly to face her daughter. "Legal bookstore?" The question hung in the air, heavy with concern and curiosity. "Yes," Grace replied, sitting at the kitchen table. "I've decided I'm going to study law, Mom. I know it's a drastic change, but after what happened..." Her voice faltered for a moment. "After what happened, I realized there are different ways to make a difference in the world." The silence that followed was broken only by the bubbling of the coffee maker. Sandra moved closer, sitting beside her daughter. "Are you sure, Grace Johnson? You've always dreamed of being a doctor. Since you were little, all your choices were based on who I was before," Grace interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "But now I'm different. As a doctor, I could heal bodies. As a lawyer, I can fight against injustice. I can stop others from going through what I went through." The first day at the bookstore was an immersion into a completely new world. The scent of fresh paper and old leather, the endless rows of legal books, and the steady stream of lawyers and law students, it all felt so far removed from the sterile labs Grace once knew so well. Between organizing shelves and helping customers, Grace began absorbing her new surroundings. Every title, legal term, and unfamiliar concept was like a tiny light sparking in her mind. During quieter moments, she allowed herself to sit in a hidden corner, devouring pages about constitutional law, landmark cases of judicial error, and theories of justice. It was during one of these afternoons that she met Marcus Rodriguez. Tall, with graying hair and piercing eyes behind thick-framed glasses, he was a regular customer at the bookstore. Grace often watched him, admiring the methodical way he selected his books, always pausing to read specific excerpts before making his choice. "Educational law?" Marcus's deep voice startled Grace one day as she was engrossed in a particularly dense legal treatise. "That's an interesting choice for a beginner." Grace Johnson looked up, meeting the lawyer's curious gaze. For a moment she hesitated. But something about Marcus's gentle expression encouraged her to speak. "I had a personal experience that got me interested in the field." Marcus pulled out a chair, sitting close to her. "Go on," he urged, his tone laced with genuine interest. That afternoon, for the first time since her expulsion, Grace shared her full story with someone outside her family. She talked about her research, about Amanda Reynolds, about the fabricated evidence, and how the Windsor Academy system had turned against her without giving her a fair chance to defend herself. When she finished, Marcus remained silent for a few moments, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "You know," he finally began, "in 30 years of practicing law, I've seen many cases like yours. The educational system, which should protect and nurture talent, sometimes becomes a tool of oppression in the wrong hands." Marcus's words struck a deep chord in Grace. She wasn't alone. Her experience, as painful as it had been, wasn't unique. There were others who had faced similar injustices, and maybe, just maybe, she could do something about it. From that day on, Marcus began mentoring her informally. He brought real cases for her to discuss during her breaks, lent her essential books, and most importantly, shared his vast experience in educational law. At home, Grace transformed her small bedroom into a makeshift study hub. The old lab photos were replaced with study schedules and notes on legal cases. Her desk, once cluttered with test tubes and experiment reports, now overflowed with annotated codes and constitutional commentaries. Money was tight and every penny had to be counted twice. Grace began tutoring science on weekends to supplement her income. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was using the same knowledge that had nearly been weaponized against her to carve out a new path. One particularly tough evening, as she walked home after a long day of work and study, Grace passed by Windsor Academy. The imposing red brick building, which had once symbolized her highest aspirations, now loomed like a dark fortress of injustice. The lab lights were still on, and through the window Grace spotted a familiar silhouette, Amanda Reynolds occupying the space that had once been hers. The hatred she initially felt was quickly replaced by something else, something closer to pity. Amanda might have won that particular battle, but her victory was hollow, built on lies and manipulation. One day, Grace murmured to herself, her voice carrying a silent promise, "I'll come back here. Not as a victim but as someone who can make a difference." Months passed, marked by long hours of work, study, and unyielding determination. Grace saved every possible penny for her law school entrance exams. Her nights were divided between shifts at the bookstore, tutoring sessions, and the endless hours of intense studying. One Sunday morning, as she sat at the small kitchen table studying, she heard a muffled sob. Looking up, she found her mother standing in the doorway, silent tears streaming down her face. "Mom? What's wrong?" Grace stood alarmed. Sandra quickly wiped away her tears, trying to smile. "It's nothing, sweetheart. It's just that, seeing you like this, studying so hard even after everything. It reminds me of your father." Grace Johnson's father had passed away when she was just 6 years old, yet his memory remained vivid. He always said education was the one thing no one could ever take from you. How ironic it seemed now, considering even that had proven vulnerable to human malice. "He would be proud of you," Sandra continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Not because of what happened but because of how you're responding. You didn't let them destroy you, Grace. You're stronger now." Those words struck something deep within Grace. Yes, she was stronger. The injustice she had endured hadn't just altered her plans, it had reshaped her very essence. The girl who once dreamed of curing diseases was now preparing to heal a broken system, one case at a time. At the bookstore, Marcus remained her informal mentor, increasingly impressed by her quick grasp of legal concepts and her ability to draw meaningful connections between different areas of law. "You have something rare, Grace," he remarked one day as they analyzed a particularly intricate case. "It's not just intelligence or dedication. You have the perspective of someone who's experienced injustice firsthand. That will make you a different kind of lawyer." As time passed, Grace began to see her expulsion in a new light. It was no longer merely a personal tragedy but the spark for something far greater. Every book she read, every case she studied, and every concept she mastered became part of a larger puzzle, one she was determined to complete no matter how long it took. The day of the law school entrance exam arrived, bringing with it a mix of anxiety and resolve. Grace woke before her alarm, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared her breakfast. In the small kitchen of their apartment, her mother was already up, quietly setting the table with extra care. "I made that chocolate cake you love," Sandra said softly, placing a warm slice on her daughter's plate. The sweet aroma filled the room, conjuring memories of simpler days when Grace's dreams were untouched by betrayal. "Thank you, Mom," Grace replied, her voice thick with emotion. It wasn't just a cake. It was a symbol of all the sacrifices her mother had made, of all the quiet support during those difficult months. The journey to the exam center was marked by a reflective silence. Grace Johnson carried with her not only the materials needed for the test but also the weight of her new aspirations. As she stepped off the bus, her eyes landed on the imposing facade of the building where she would take the exam. It was a defining moment, her first concrete step toward her new life. As she walked through the hallways in search of her room, Grace noticed the other candidates. Some looked as though they had stepped out of law offices, while others had the worn look of those, like her, who had studied tirelessly in their spare time. They all shared the same determined gaze. The exam began promptly at 8 a.m. Grace took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The first questions flowed naturally. Months of intensive studying at the bookstore were beginning to pay off. Her mind was clear, focused, turning each question into a challenge to be conquered. However, when she reached the section on educational law, something unexpected happened. One of the essay questions presented a hypothetical case strikingly similar to her own. A student unjustly accused of academic fraud without proper defense. For a moment, Grace felt the air leave her lungs. Stay calm, she whispered to herself, closing her eyes for a second. This wasn't just another question. It was her story, her pain, her struggle. And now, she had the opportunity to turn this experience into something constructive. With surprising clarity, Grace began to craft her response. Each word she wrote carried not only technical knowledge but also a profound understanding of what it was like to live through the consequences of a broken educational system. Her pen glided across the paper with urgency, as if every sentence was a step closer to the justice she had longed for. Upon leaving the exam hours later, Grace Johnson found Marcus waiting for her on the sidewalk, holding 2 cups of coffee. The veteran lawyer had become more than just a mentor. He had become an ally in her journey of transformation. "How did it go?" he asked, handing her one of the cups. Grace took a sip of the coffee before answering, letting the warmth of the drink soothe her tired body. "There was a question, about a case very similar to mine." Marcus nodded, a glint of understanding in his experienced eyes. "Sometimes, Grace, our greatest wounds become our greatest strengths. You have something that many lawyers take years to develop. Real empathy for those who suffer injustice." The following weeks were filled with agonizing waiting. Grace continued her routine at the bookstore, but every spare moment was dedicated to planning her next steps. On a particularly busy afternoon, while organizing a new shipment of books, she came across a volume on famous cases of overturned wrongful convictions. Flipping through the pages during her break, Grace found stories of people who, like her, had faced the system and managed to prove their innocence. Each case was a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, was still possible. It was in that moment that her phone buzzed. It was an email from the law school. With trembling hands, Grace opened the message. Her heart stopped for a moment as she read the first lines. She had been accepted, with one of the highest scores in the selection process. The news spread quickly. Sandra left work early that day to celebrate with her daughter. Marcus showed up at the bookstore with a bottle of wine and a special gift, a set of new legal codes, essential for her first year of law school. "This is just the beginning," he said as they toasted to the future. "You have a long road ahead, but I'm sure you'll make a difference." However, the joy of the acceptance was quickly tempered by financial reality. Even with a partial scholarship, the costs of law school were daunting. Grace knew she would need to keep her job at the bookstore and take on tutoring sessions to afford the tuition fees. One night, while studying her enrollment papers, Grace overheard her mother on the phone, negotiating a loan with the bank. The sound of Sandra's voice trying to explain their financial situation to the bank manager made Grace's heart tighten. "Mom, you don't have to do this," Grace protested as Sandra hung up the phone. "I can try for a student loan or maybe work more hours." Sandra firmly held her daughter's hands. "Grace, when your father died, I promised myself I would do everything I could to give you the opportunities he dreamed of for our daughter. I won't let anything, not even money, stop you from realizing your potential." Her mother's words brought tears to Grace's eyes. It was a moment of realization. Her struggle was not just hers, but of all those who believed in her. The injustice she had suffered at Windsor School had tried to break her spirit, but instead, it had forged something stronger. The following week, when she entered the law school campus for the first time, Grace carried with her not just books and dreams, but a clear mission. Each step through the historic halls was a reminder of her journey to that point. During the opening lecture, sitting among dozens of other freshmen, Grace listened intently to every word from the professors. When one mentioned the importance of ethics and justice in the practice of law, she felt her heart race. She wasn't there just to study laws, she was there to learn how to change them, to protect those who, like her, had been silenced by the system. At the end of that first week of classes, Grace made an unexpected visit to Windsor School. She didn't go inside, she just stood across the street, observing the building. The lab windows still glistened with the same lights, but now she saw them with new eyes. They were no longer symbols of lost dreams, but reminders of her newfound mission. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Marcus. "How was the first week?" Grace typed her reply with a determined smile. "It's just the beginning. But I already know exactly where I want to go." As she walked home that night, Grace reflected on how much her life had changed in such a short time. The pain of the injustice was still there, but now it fueled something greater. She was no longer just a victim of the system, she was becoming someone capable of changing it. In her room before going to sleep, Grace took her old lab coat, tucked away at the bottom of her closet. She folded it carefully and placed it in a box, along with her old science medals. They were no longer symbols of defeat, but milestones of a necessary transformation. Next to her bed, a new picture had replaced the old medical posters. A simple quote she had found in one of the books at the bookstore: "Justice is not just a goal, it is a journey." And Grace was just beginning hers. The first year of law school turned out to be a much greater challenge than Grace had imagined. Mornings began before the sun rose, with her studying the previous day's cases while sipping her rushed coffee. Nights ended late, after long hours spent between classes, working at the bookstore and study sessions that seemed endless. "You need to rest a little," Sandra commented one night, finding her daughter asleep over her books at the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional flipping of pages. Grace lifted her head, blinking to shake off the sleep. "I can't, Mom. I have a constitutional law exam tomorrow, and I still need to review 3 chapters. "And how do you plan to take the exam if you're too exhausted to think?" Sandra asked, placing a cup of hot tea beside her daughter. The chamomile aroma filled the room, offering some comfort on the chilly night. Grace knew her mother was right, but the fear of failure consumed her. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Every grade, every assignment, every presentation was a chance to prove her worth, not just to herself but to everyone who had doubted her. At law school, Grace stood out not only for her exceptional grades but for the unique perspective she brought to classroom discussions. During a debate on ethics in the educational system, she surprised everyone with her deep, personal analysis of the topic. Justice in the academic environment cannot just be a set of rules, she argued, her voice strong, resonating through the room. It needs to be a living system, one that protects both institutional integrity and the individual rights of students. Professor Johnson, a middle-aged man known for his skepticism, raised his eyebrows with interest. "You speak like someone who knows the subject from personal experience, Miss Martins." Grace hesitated for a moment, feeling the curious gazes of her classmates. "Yes, Professor. I've seen both sides of the system, its ability to build and its ability to destroy." That class marked a turning point in her academic journey. Professor Johnson, impressed by her perspective, began mentoring her on a research project about reforms in the disciplinary system of educational institutions. On a particularly productive afternoon at the college library, Grace uncovered a disturbing pattern in her case studies. "Professor," she called, showing him her notes, "I noticed that in 70% of academic fraud expulsion cases over the past 5 years, students did not have proper access to a defense process." Johnson examined the data carefully. "This is significant, Grace. You might be uncovering something important here." Her work at the bookstore remained her primary source of income, but now it had an additional purpose. Marcus, her mentor, had started bringing her real cases to analyze, preparing her for the practical challenges of the profession. "Take a look at this case," he said one day, handing her a thick folder. A high school student was expelled for allegedly hacking the school system. But the evidence is circumstantial at best. Grace spent hours poring over the case, identifying procedural flaws and possible defense strategies. When she presented her conclusions to Marcus, he smiled with approval. "You have an instinct for this, Grace. It's not just technical knowledge. You understand the human dimension of these cases." At home, the financial struggles continued. Sandra had managed to secure the loan to help with tuition, but the interest rates were high, and every bill paid was a small victory. Grace started tutoring other students in law on weekends to ease the financial burden a little. One night, while organizing her finances at the small kitchen table, Grace heard her mother softly crying in her room. Silently, she approached the slightly open door. "Dad," Sandra whispered to an old photo, "I wish you could see our girl now. She's so strong, so determined. But sometimes I'm afraid I won't be able to give her everything she needs." Grace's heart tightened. That night, lying in bed, she made a decision. She couldn't just be a good student, she had to be exceptional. She needed to find a way to turn her knowledge into something that could truly help people, while also building a better future for her family. In college, Grace became involved with the Legal Practice Group, where students offered free legal assistance to the community. It was there that she met Maria, a high school student who had been wrongly accused of cheating on an important exam. "No one believes me," Maria said, her eyes filled with tears. "I've already lost my place in school, and now no other institution wants to accept me." Grace felt a familiar tightness in her chest. "I believe you," she said firmly. "And I'm going to help you prove your innocence." With guidance from Marcus and Professor Johnson, Grace threw herself into Maria's case. She spent nights poring over documents, interviewing witnesses, and building a solid defense. The case became her obsession, a chance to do for someone else what no one had done for her. During the hearing at the Department of Education, Grace presented clear evidence of flaws in the accusatory process. Her argument was sharp, grounded not only in law but in a deep understanding of the impact an unjust accusation could have on a student's life. When the verdict came down in Maria's favor, Grace felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was the confirmation that she was on the right path. The smile on Maria's face, the gratitude in her eyes, meant more than any grade or academic praise. "How did you do it?" Maria asked afterward, still in shock over the outcome. Grace smiled, remembering her own journey. "Let's just say I know exactly what you've been through. And now I can do something about it." Maria's case spread through the college, attracting attention from other students and professors. Soon, Grace began receiving similar requests for help. Each new case was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to make the difference she had longed for. One autumn afternoon, as she walked across campus, Grace stopped in front of the bulletin board. Among the various flyers and announcements, there was one calling for applications to an internship program at the public prosecutor's office, focused on educational law cases. Her hands trembled slightly as she ripped the flyer from the bulletin board. It was a unique opportunity, the chance to work directly with cases that could change the system from within. But the competition would be fierce, and she knew her past could be an obstacle. That night, sitting in her room, Grace reread the internship requirements for the 10th time. On the wall, the old poster of the Supreme Court seemed to watch her with a new perspective. It was no longer just a distant symbol of justice, it was a constant reminder of her mission. "I'm going to try," she said to herself, starting to prepare her application. "If I get this position, I'll be able to do much more than just help individual cases. I'll be able to start changing the system." The semester went on, and with it grew Grace's determination. Every new case she studied, every victory she achieved in the legal practice group, was a step closer to her greater goal. It was no longer just about proving her own innocence, it was about building a more just educational system for everyone. The selection process for the internship at the public prosecutor's office was rigorous. Grace faced 3 elimination stages, competing with hundreds of other candidates. The final stage was a personal interview with prosecutor Catherine Reynolds, known for her tough stance on institutional corruption cases. "Why did you choose educational law?" Catherine asked, her penetrating gaze fixed on Grace. The prosecutor's office was austere, its walls lined with diplomas and certificates, silent witnesses to the interrogation. Grace took a deep breath before answering. She had rehearsed this response dozens of times, but now, sitting before the prosecutor, she decided to abandon her prepared speech. "Because I know exactly what it's like to have your life destroyed by a corrupt system," Grace replied, her voice firm. "I was unfairly expelled from Windsor Academy 2 years ago, accused of a fraud I didn't commit. No one wanted to listen to me, no one investigated properly. And I found out I wasn't alone. There are hundreds of similar stories." Catherine leaned forward, intrigued. "And don't you think this personal experience could compromise your objectivity?" "On the contrary," Grace answered. "It gives me a unique perspective. I understand both the value of the rules and the importance of a fair process. I'm not seeking revenge, I'm seeking systemic change." A week later, Grace received the news: she had gotten the position. But her initial joy was quickly replaced with apprehension when she found out her first case involved an investigation at Windsor Academy itself. "We've received reports of administrative irregularities," Catherine explained, handing Grace a thick folder. "We need to investigate a possible scheme involving the manipulation of grades and academic results." Grace's heart raced as she opened the folder. Among the documents, she found a familiar pattern, the same kind of forged evidence that had been used against her. But now, with her legal training, she could clearly see the inconsistencies. For weeks, Grace worked tirelessly on the case, reconstructing a complex web of fraud that had stretched over the years. Each new document revealed more connections, more victims, more perpetrators. Amanda Reynolds was just a small piece in a much larger scheme. One afternoon, as she reviewed old files, Grace found something that made her blood run cold. It was an email from Professor Diana Wells to Director Thompson, dated 2 weeks before her expulsion. "We need to get rid of Grace Johnson. She's getting too close to uncovering the scholarship scheme. If she keeps investigating for her research project, our entire system could be exposed." Grace felt the air leave her lungs. Her expulsion hadn't been just the result of Amanda's jealousy, she had been silenced because she was about to uncover something much bigger. "Promoter Reynolds," Grace called, walking into Catherine's office with the organized evidence. "I think I found something that goes far beyond simple grade manipulation." In the following weeks, the investigation intensified. Grace worked side by side with Catherine, building a solid case that uncovered a scheme involving the diversion of scholarship funds, falsification of research results, and an elaborate system of expelling students who threatened to expose the truth. One night, as she organized the evidence in her small room, Grace received an unexpected call. It was Marcus. "Grace, you need to be careful." His voice was tense. "I just found out that Director Thompson is trying to figure out who's leading the investigation. They have powerful connections." Marcus's warning proved true. The next morning, Grace found her cabinet at the prosecutor's office had been broken into. All the files were intact. This was clearly an attempt at intimidation. "I'm not backing down," Grace declared when Catherine suggested she distance herself from the case for safety. "I ran away once. I'm not doing it again." The turning point came when Grace gained access to the school's financial records. The numbers didn't lie. Millions in research funds and scholarships had been embezzled over the years. Every unjust expulsion was linked to a student who had somehow gotten too close to the truth. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Catherine asked, reviewing the final report. "Once we present this evidence, there's no turning back." Grace looked out the office window, watching the sunset over the city. "I am. It's not about me anymore, it's about all the others who were silenced. It's about making sure this never happens again." On the morning of the operation, Grace watched from a distance as agents entered the Windsor School. She saw Director Thompson being escorted out, followed by Professor Wells and other administrators. Amanda Reynolds was among them, her face pale with shock as she recognized Grace among the members of the public prosecutor's office. The press soon arrived, and the headlines didn't take long to appear. $1 million fraud scheme uncovered at prestigious school, administrators arrested for systemic corruption, delayed justice, wrongfully expelled former students to be vindicated. That night, alone in her room, Grace finally allowed the tears to fall. They weren't tears of sadness or anger but of relief. The truth she had so long searched for wasn't just about her personal story, it was about an entire system that needed to be exposed and reformed. Sandra entered the room and sat beside her daughter. "You did it, my dear. You didn't just prove your innocence, you protected others from going through the same thing you went through." Grace hugged her mother, feeling the weight of the past few years finally beginning to dissipate. "It's not over yet, Mom. This is just the beginning. There's still so much work to be done." The next day, when Grace entered the prosecutor's office, she found her desk covered with letters. They were messages from former Windsor students, other students who had been wrongfully expelled over the years. Each letter told a story similar to hers. Dreams interrupted, careers destroyed, lives forever altered. "What do you plan to do with all these stories?" Catherine asked, watching Grace read the letters with tears in her eyes. Grace looked up, determined. "I'm going to use each one of them to change the system. It's not enough to punish the guilty, we need to make sure this never happens again in any institution." The Windsor case had become a landmark in the country's educational system. The halls of the prosecutor's office, once quiet and austere, now pulsed with new energy. Grace, formerly appointed special assistant to the prosecutor's office for educational cases, saw her workload multiply every day. Her small office, located on the third floor of the historic Ministry of Justice building, had transformed into a point of reference for students, teachers, and institutions seeking guidance in academic disputes. The walls, once bare, now displayed a growing collection of newspaper clippings about resolved cases and letters of thanks from families who had found justice through her work. On her desk, a neatly stacked pile of case files awaited her attention, each folder representing a life that could be transformed. On a particularly hectic Monday morning, while Grace was reviewing documents for a new case, her secretary announced an unexpected visitor. As she looked up, the air seemed to leave her lungs. Amanda Reynolds was standing at her door, almost unrecognizable. The months of house arrest had left deep marks on her once proud face. "May I come in?" Amanda asked, her voice trembling slightly. The expensive blazer and the arrogant posture that used to define her had been replaced by simple clothes and slumped shoulders. Grace gestured to the chair in front of her, keeping a neutral expression despite the whirlwind of emotions Amanda's presence stirred. "How can I help you?" "I came to apologize," Amanda began, her eyes fixed on the polished wooden floor. I had no idea how big the scheme was when I agreed to participate. I thought it was just about securing your spot in the research project." Grace watched every movement of her former rival, years of legal training helping her maintain composure. "Why?" she asked simply, her voice controlled. "Why did you do it?" Amanda lifted her gaze, unshed tears shimmering in her eyes. "Envy mostly," she confessed, her voice cracking. You were everything I wanted to be: brilliant, dedicated, respected. When Professor Thompson approached me with the proposal, I saw a chance to take your place. He said it would just be a small manipulation of data, nothing serious. And didn't you think about the consequences? Grace pressed, leaning forward in her chair. Didn't you consider the impact it would have on my life? I thought it was just another academic game, Amanda replied, finally letting the tears fall. When I realized the full extent of the scheme, I was already too involved. They had evidence against me too. It was a vicious cycle. Each new fraud just covered up the previous one. Silence hung heavily between the two women. Grace thought about all the moments of despair she had lived through, the sleepless nights, the disappointed look on her mother's face when she told her about the expulsion. She remembered the endless hours in the bookstore, the late nights studying, the constant struggle to prove her worth again. I can't undo what happened, Amanda continued, her voice firmer now. But I want to try to do something right. I have more information about other similar schemes at other institutions. Names, dates, documents that prove a much larger network of corruption. I'm willing to testify. Grace felt her heart race. It was the chance to expand the investigation, to prevent others from going through what she had. But it was also a moral crossroads. How much of her humanity was she willing to preserve after all she had suffered? Why now? Grace asked, studying her former rival's face carefully. Why after all this time? Because I saw what you did, Amanda replied, wiping the tears away with the back of her hand. You could have used all that power for revenge, you could have completely destroyed me, but you chose to fight for justice. That made me rethink a lot of things. I spent months watching your work in the newspapers, seeing how you turned your own tragedy into something bigger than yourself. Grace stood up, walking over to the window of her office. Outside, the university campus was buzzing with life. Students crossed the well-kept lawns, carrying their dreams and ambitions, just as she had once carried hers. How many of them could be saved from the experience she had lived through? I'll hear what you have to say, Grace finally replied, turning back to Amanda. Not for you, but for all the others who need protection. Amanda's revelations turned out to be more important than Grace could have imagined. In the following months, a quiet and meticulous operation began to take shape. Grace worked tirelessly, expanding the investigation to other institutions, following every lead with the precision of a surgeon. The work consumed her days and nights. Her small apartment became an impromptu office, with walls covered in diagrams connecting people, institutions, and events. Sandra often found her asleep on piles of documents, still dressed in her work clothes. You need to rest, her mother would say, covering her with a blanket. You can't save the world if you don't take care of yourself. But Grace couldn't stop. Each new case revealed was a chance for correction, an opportunity to transform the system from within. She established a support network for wronged students, offering not only legal assistance but also counseling and professional guidance. Marcus, her former mentor from the bookstore, now worked alongside her as a special consultant. You've built something extraordinary here, he commented one day, observing the constant stream of people seeking help. You've turned your pain into purpose. On a particularly significant afternoon, while finalizing the details of a new case, Grace received a call that would change the course of her work. It was Catherine Reynolds, her voice laden with contained excitement. Grace, the National Education Board wants you to lead a special task force, Catherine announced. They want to implement nationwide the protocols you've developed to prevent academic fraud. Your work over the last few months has caught the attention of the right people. Grace felt the weight of those words. It was more than a promotion. It was the recognition that her personal struggle had evolved into something much bigger than herself. Her eyes wandered to the wall of her office, where her old photo from Windsor Academy was now framed, alongside her law degree. It was a constant reminder of how the greatest victories sometimes arise from the worst defeats. I accept, Grace replied, her voice steady. But I have some conditions. I want the task force to include student representatives. We need to hear the voices that are usually silenced. And I want full autonomy to investigate any institution, without political interference. That night, as she shared the news with her mother during dinner, Grace finally allowed the magnitude of her journey to sink in. It was no longer just about correcting a personal injustice. It was about transforming an entire system. You know, Mom, Grace said, holding Sandra's hand across the table, sometimes I think everything that happened was necessary. If I hadn't gone through it, how many other people would have continued suffering in silence? Sandra smiled, her eyes shining with pride and unshed tears. Your father always said that the greatest storms bring the most important transformations. You've turned your pain into purpose, daughter. That's what makes you special. The next day, when Grace entered her office, she found a pile of new cases waiting for her attention. Each folder represented a story, a life, a chance to make a difference. With a determined smile, she began another day of work, knowing that each small victory was a step toward the change she dreamed of seeing in the world. The task force quickly began to take shape. Grace personally selected each member, prioritizing not only technical competence but also a commitment to justice and empathy for the victims. Amanda, keeping her word, became a valuable collaborator, her inside knowledge of fraud schemes helping to dismantle other similar operations. The work was exhausting but rewarding. Each new case solved, each student reinstated, each institution reformed was a small victory in the long battle to transform the educational system. Grace knew there was still much to be done, but now she had the tools and the power to make the real difference she had always dreamed of. 5 years had passed since the creation of the National Task Force. Grace's office, now occupying an entire floor in the prosecutor's building, had become a symbol of hope for students and institutions across the country. The walls, once bare, now told stories of success through photos, certificates, and letters of gratitude. On a sunny spring morning, Grace adjusted her robe in front of the mirror. Today was no ordinary day. She had been invited to give the commencement address at the law school where her journey had begun. The auditorium was packed, filled with young, hopeful faces. When I was expelled from Windsor College, Grace began, her voice echoing through the silent hall, I thought my life was over. My dreams of becoming a doctor were shattered, my reputation ruined, my future seemingly lost. But I discovered that sometimes we need to lose everything to find our true calling. In the front rows, Sandra smiled proudly, silent tears streaming down her face. Beside her was Marcus, now the director of the student legal aid program that he and Sophia had created together. In 5 years, our task force has investigated over 1,000 cases of academic misconduct, Grace continued. We've managed to reinstate hundreds of unjustly expelled students. We've implemented protection protocols in more than 500 institutions. But our greatest success isn't in the numbers. It's in the lives we've transformed. In the audience, Grace recognized familiar faces. Maria, the first student she had helped, was now a promising lawyer with her own practice. Amanda Reynolds, who had served her sentence and redeemed herself, was working as an educational ethics consultant, using her experience to prevent others from making the same mistakes. The education system is not perfect, Grace continued, but now we have the tools to make it more just. Each one of you, graduates, has the power to continue this transformation. No matter which area of law you choose, always remember, justice is not just an abstract concept. It's something we build every day, through our choices and actions. After the ceremony, as she received hugs and congratulations, Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Catherine Reynolds, now the Attorney General. You've exceeded all expectations, Catherine said with a smile. The National Council wants to expand the program even further. We're thinking of creating a specific department for student rights protection, and we want you to lead it. Grace felt the weight of the proposal. It was an opportunity to extend her work even further, to touch more lives. But before she could respond, she was interrupted by a young student. Dr. Martins, the girl called timidly. I read about your story and, well, I'm going through something similar at my college. Could you give me some advice? Grace exchanged a meaningful glance with Catherine before turning to the student. Of course, she replied with a warm smile. Let's talk. Later, at home, Grace found her mother preparing a special celebratory dinner. The small apartment, which had witnessed so many nights of studying and moments of despair, was now filled with joy and fulfillment. Remember that night after my expulsion? Grace asked, helping her mother set the table. When you told me we would find a way? Sandra stopped what she was doing and turned to her daughter. I remember. You were so lost, but there was something in your eyes, a determination that told me you would find your strength. You never stopped believing in me, Grace hugged her mother. Even when I doubted myself. The dinner was a celebration not just of the speech that day, but of the entire journey. Marcus brought a special bottle of wine, kept since the day Grace passed the bar exam. Catherine contributed an elegant dessert. It was a different kind of family, united not by blood, but by a shared history of struggle and triumph. As she looked around at the people she loved, Grace reflected on how her life had changed. The injustice she had suffered could have turned her into a bitter, vengeful person. Instead, she had become a force for positive change, helping others find justice and redemption. On the wall of her room, the old Supreme Court poster still held its place of honor, but now it was surrounded by dozens of photos, reinstated students, reunited families, rebuilt lives. Each picture was a reminder that sometimes the greatest defeats can turn into the most meaningful victories. The next day, as she entered her office, Grace found the formal proposal from the National Council on her desk. Beside it was a new stack of cases waiting for her attention. She smiled, thinking about how each challenge was an opportunity to make a difference. She picked up her favorite pen, the same one she had used to sign her enrollment at law school, and began to work. There was still so much to be done, so many lives to touch, so many injustices to right. But now she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The girl who once dreamed of healing bodies had become a woman who healed something even more fundamental. The very system that shaped the future of people. And that, she had discovered, was the greatest healing of all. And you, what did you think of this story of perseverance and justice? If you were moved by Grace's journey, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Your thoughts in the comments are very important to us. Tell us what you would do in Grace's shoes. Together, we can continue sharing inspiring stories that remind us of the power of perseverance and the importance of fighting for what's right. Until the next story.